Good morning. Welcome to Village. My name's Andrew. I'm the lead pastor, and we're really excited you're hanging out with us today. We are starting a brand new series called Back in the Day, and that's just what we're doing. We're going to have some fun looking back in the day, and hopefully, though, by the end of this series, we'll also have a good time finding not only where we've come from and what was back there, but what's ahead of us and what God has planned for us and designed for us. But we thought it would be fun to go a little retro, to go a little vintage, as we talked about back in the day. I've actually had a really good time preparing for this series because in the last couple of weeks, I've tried to hit every thrift store between here and Macon, Georgia. And so they know me by name now. They see me coming, and they really love me coming because I go to the one area that no one else goes to, and certainly that no one else purchases anything from, because I've been going to their technology areas and just grabbing up some of their trendy technology. What I'm going to do is just kind of to get us going here. I'm going to go kind of around the stage here just a little bit, point a few things out to you, and by show of hands, which will also be show of age, we will find out what things you are familiar with, maybe what things you have used or know how to use, and we may even get you to teach us how to use them, okay? So I came across this great find the other day at one of the thrift stores. You might know what this is right here? See down here? Yeah, it is. It's a slide projector. It's not an actual film projector. It predates the twisting film projectors that we would put in and roll our films to, all right, in science class. But this does one slide at a time with an alternate slide to go. So you put your slide in, you show it, then you slide another slide in the top, you rotate this down, then you put another slide out, slide in, and you rotate this down, you take the slide out, and you rotate this down, and this goes on and on. We're actually going to have a little contest to see if our media guys can run worship on this next week, okay? It's like, oh no, they've got to slow down singing. We've got to put more words on the slide. So we're going to challenge them with that. That was actually a sweet find. I think it was like $9. I found this for $9. That was pretty sweet. Pretty good deal on that. Now, some of you are familiar with this, okay? I actually didn't have to buy this. This came from my in-laws' basement. So this is fantastic. This is a manual typewriter. Okay, now how many of you grew up actually using manual typewriters? Okay, there it is. Just own it. Yeah, just own it. Just get it on out there. Okay, we had one in our home growing up. My mom did some administrative work and secretarial work, and then my dad was always typing papers and getting things ready. He put all of his sermon notes and stuff on this. Now, the struggle with manual typewriter was even if you got good and you got fast, what happens, right? After the keys, they all begin to overlap and they'll get jammed, and you got to pull them down. And then you get your hands on the ribbon and your hands turn all black, right? And there is no delete button. There's no delete button, right? If it doesn't work, it's, all right, we pull it out and we start over. Now, my 11-year-old Will, he's been fascinated just with this feature this week, right here. We've been doing this all week long, right? It's like, hey, you know what? Will's in danger of getting in some trouble today. Do you have something you can put him doing? I'm like, oh, I got something he can do, right? Hours and hours. Okay, so you get it, right? You remember that familiar noise. Who can forget this, right? The original mobile car phones. Come on, crazy cooter, what you going on out there, right? Okay, from your Dukes of Hazzard days, we got the CB. In fact, does anybody know what CB stands for? Citizens Band. Fantastic, man. Look at you guys. You're out there. You know what CB stands for. My uncle did some trucking and different things like that. So he always had CBs in all of his cars. And when we were hanging out at my grandparents' house and his old trucks and things were hanging around, man, we were in the cars. Even if we didn't know how to work them, we were pretending, it's fantastic, running CBs. Right down here is your handheld transistor radio, okay, AM, FM. And then the thing that changed the world. The iPod before the iPod. The cassette Walkman. That's right, the Sony Walkman. I'm walking, I'm listening to music, I'm not attached to a wall. This is fantastic. Check me out. Right, the Walkman, man, it changed everything. I don't know if you had the Walkman, but then right after the Walkman, we got the Discman. Some of you predate that stuff, though, and you know what these things hanging on the wall is. There's Barry Manilow Live, okay? What are those called? Albums, right? It's funny that we still call them albums. Everybody has an album release. It's like, somebody releases Taylor Swift just released her new album. Did she? I don't think so. We got some guys that are throwing it back to vinyl, and that's pretty cool. But we'll go back to typewriters for a second. Okay, there's your manual typewriter, but let's don't miss out on this baby. Man, y'all knew it. The IBM Selectric 2. This is a Selectric 2, okay, man. This is pretty sweet right here, okay? This will give a machine gun a run for its money right here. Right? Thing's incredible. Now, I did plug this in last night to see if it worked and almost burned the church down. But you are welcome to take this home with you if you would like to. By the way, we'll make all this available later. If somebody needs to remove this junk from this stage, put it back in your house, so a year from now, you can take it back to a thrift store, and 2 years from now, we'll do this series again. All right, so that's how that works. That's how the rotation works. And then, man, we've got all kinds of other, how could I not make it over here, right? Not cassette. It's not an album. It is a sweet 8-track. Now, I would like to tell you, I did not have to go to any thrift store for this. This was plugged in the basement of my parents' home. All right, I just went down the road and picked it up and borrowed it. And let me tell you what's rolling in the disc right now. That looks like a little Glenn Campbell Rhinestone Cowboy. There it is. See if we can work that out for worship next week for you. Like a rhinestone. You knew it, man. Just own it, man. That's okay. Right? And I've got this sweet collection of all these discs, and there's some Charlie Pride in there. There's no telling what else we got. Paul Anka. Yeah, some good stuff. All right. So, but the 8-track, right? The 8-track was classic, and some of you even had that in your car. Okay, you had the 8-track in your car, and that was just fantastic. I mean, we're just conjuring up all kinds of memories. Oh, man, speaking of memories, let's just roll back here. We've got our console TV, right? And no remote control needed here. You can just use your hands. It's fantastic. Okay, you got that. And then we've got our VCR. Actually, this is not too throwback. This is a dual VCR DVD player, but it's nice to have. And I've got that from my parents' house. And then, did anyone have one of these? You know what these are? I'll take a guess. Yes, this is actually a VHS tape rewinder. And these things were critical if you were an avid movie watcher. And here's the reason why, right? Because if you thought your late tax penalty was high, try returning a videotape unrewound, okay? You remember that? If you rented a videotape, you can ask Debbie down here. They come in unrewound, man. High fees, high charges. Debbie used to rent those. So, but I remember that. Or if you want to get on to the next movie, you ain't got time to rewind that one. You need something else to do it. And the reason you can't just take it out and pop it off is because if it's one of your favorite movies, like, for example, the dual cassette version of The Sound of Music, okay? Some of you are like, oh, I thought he was not joking. Okay, sorry, I was actually. But you didn't want to have to wait, right? When you pull that back out the next time, you don't have to rewind that thing. It takes too long, and that's what this solved, okay? And as great as that was, if you had one of these, you knew you had arrived. I'm just going to read for you what this is. This is the Radio Shack automatic antenna rotator. The radio, yes, sir, that's right. You know what? We had an automatic antenna rotator at our house. His name was Andrew. And some of y'all remember that, right? It's freezing cold, but the TV's a little fuzzy. And they'd be like, Andrew will go outside, and you're out there, and they're like, no, turn it towards Asheville, not Nashville, Asheville, right? And you're tweaking, and they're like, hold it right there, and it's not staying, and you're trying to brace things against the pole. It would have this wire that ran down from the antenna into the basement window of the house and through the basement and back up to your TV. And the wire was always breaking because it was just the right height for a lawnmower or a bike to tear it up. Yeah, y'all remember antennas. I do too. It's fascinating. So, but I mean, these things, right, they just bring back all kinds of memory. And it doesn't take much to get the back in the day conversation going. In fact, yesterday, I took a minute and I stopped in on my grandfather, Ralph Myers, and yesterday was his birthday. Not just any birthday, though. Yesterday was his 93rd birthday. He was born in 1925. And so when I sit with my grandfather, I love it. He's a storyteller, and so we'll always launch in and get some stories going and different things. And he always asks, he always asks, what do you guys got going on at church? What's going on? And so I was telling him, I was like, well, actually, I stopped by to say happy birthday, but I needed to see if I could grab a couple of things, too, from you, because we're doing this series called Back in the Day. All I had to do was mention the name, Back in the Day, and he goes, oh, man, well, back in my day, and here we were, man. We were off, and he's telling me stories. Back in my day, we had to ride our horses into town from Brasstown on the dirt road for the Nickel Picture Show, right? And I was like, man, that's incredible. I love to hear those stories back in the day. In fact, he told me before I leave, and if you got to know my grandmother, okay, they don't keep some stuff that they've had. They keep everything they've ever had since 1925. He's got it all. And so before I leave, she overhears the conversation. And so she comes out with all these different things that I need to be taking with me. And she loans me her original selfie maker. We call this a Polaroid, right? You young bucks thought y'all invented selfies? No, these have been going on for a long time. And we were actually out of film, but this one was stuck. And so you get the idea. Y'all remember the Polaroids. And what do? Come on, dry. trying to get those things dried off. But they gave me that. They also, they gave me this. This is my grandfather's rotary phone that has hung by his bed for probably 50 years, I guess. It doesn't work anymore, but he said, you can take that. And so, y'all remember the rotary phones? And I've told you before, I hated these things, especially because I had a friend that had 4 zeros in his number. Oh, it's like, man, I hate calling Doug. 0. And so what do? You force it back faster. Right? It's like, come on. 0, right? But some of you can remember some of you can possibly remember when you didn't have to dial anything. You just picked up, right? And it was the party line, right? The party line. And you were like, hey, I was just going to see if you could connect me with so-and-so. And they were like, oh, I'm already on. I was just listening to see if other people were talking. Waiting for you, right? Or a lot of you may remember when you didn't have to dial the exchange anymore. The full exchange, right? With 389, 837, 896, you could just dial the last digit of the exchange. So for 389, you would just dial 9, and then the 4 digits that ended, or 7 for 837, and the 4 digits. So it's interesting just how far we've come. And then before I left, my mom gave me this, right? You know what this is? It's an iron, right? It's an iron. And now we mostly use them for antique door stops, but so she was telling me the stories about ironing with these irons, setting them on the wood stove, letting them get all heated up. You got to grab them with a pot holder. You run them over your pants and try not to burn a hole in the butt, and she's like, don't leave that sitting too long right there. Okay, and fascinating stories. And she would even tell me that sometimes they would take like these irons and they would heat them up, and then they would stick them under their mattresses to heat their beds up. How did we not burn this country down? That's fascinating. I was like, oh, okay, let me put that down before I get burnt, right? But it is just incredible how just little things like this can begin to jog our memory. It doesn't take much to make us really nostalgic. Here's actually a few more fun things that we found. Did most everybody have this right here in your home? The picture that everybody's mom and grandma owned, okay? You remember these Tupperware pictures? With the kind of spongy lid, the stopper lid. This is where the Kool-Aid lived, right here in the sweet tea, okay? Right? And then there's this sweet reminder. You can still hear the sound this ball made when it hit you right now, can't you? Yeah, right in the face. Yeah, you got it. Right? It's fantastic. So, and then I thought this was funny because somebody created this. It says age test. What's the connection between these two objects? Everybody knows. That's how you rewound your. That's after your broke Walkman ate your tape, and that thing was strung out 3 feet. You're like, I could do this all day, right? You remember that, but when we think about the past and we think about things back in the day, one of the things that we do tend to do is we tend to over-romanticize. And especially when we're talking about our day, we like to talk about our era and the things that go on. And that's fun and that's fine. And things were good. That's fine. But I think sometimes we can overdo it. And we can maybe, to quote one of our former presidents, sometimes we can misremember exactly how things were going. Some of you showed your age right there. You knew that quote, right? But we can kind of forget exactly how things were because not everything was fantastic. In fact, here's maybe one of the things that we got wrong. This was an advertisement for a station wagon, and this is what it said in the advertisement. The rear of the wagon is a play area. Is it? Right? And I love this. You can't always see it from the light. This is a baby laying down in the corner over here. There you go. Yeah, that's a child. Right? Maybe we're better than that now. Okay, maybe things are a little better. We're a little more conscious. And you don't have to look any further than this guy's hair right here to know that some things are better. Right? Come on, Billy Ray. What in the world is going on? Everything wasn't better back in the day, but sometimes we long for the good old days. And that's not, like I say, that's not inherently a bad thing because there were some great things that happened back in the day, and it's fun to kind of reminisce about those and talk about them. But sometimes we can overdo it, and we begin to long for those things a lot of times. And again, that's okay too. The problem occurs whenever we begin to let some of those things that were back in the day or even back from our past or whatever begin to sneak back in and replace or take the place of the things that we do have in front of us and in our possession that actually are better. Right? Because the truth is, we've made some advancements. There's some things that are better. And whenever you begin to substitute the past, or you begin to substitute something lesser for something better, that's when you and I begin to suffer the consequences. And sometimes it's funny. I mean, sometimes it can be humorous like this. This person made this video that had to do with the typewriter era. We've been talking about typewriters here for a second. And this is kind of what potentially can happen once you move from the typewriter era into the computer era, but your mind begins to drift back in that direction. You have that? Just show this. Right? I mean, and it's like, it's not a big deal, but every once in a while, maybe it is a big deal, right? I mean, it's like, oh no. And so we see these kind of things happen. You may be going, well, what does this have to do with church? What does this have to do with what we're talking about today? What in the world does this have to do with you and I? Well, the truth is that historically, right, we see these things happen, is that we have things that come along in our lives, and every generation has the next best thing or the next better thing, and those things are kind of happening to us and around us, and we progress and we move on normally to the better thing. But a lot of times, right, we tend to stay stuck in one position, stay stuck in the past, or we have a really difficult time buying into the better, whether we like it or not. And even the people who would say that, oh, I'm okay with change, all of us struggle at some point in transitioning from the old into the new, into what we used to be, into what we could be, or what's coming next. And that doesn't just happen with fads and trends and objects and technology, right? I mean, my dad's still holding close to his flip phone. We finally got him to go to that, which we're pretty excited about. He started texting last year. He was really pumped about it, okay? I was like, yeah, we've been doing that for a while now, okay? He's like, and what's this electronic mail stuff? I was like, I'll teach you all about email later, okay, right? But I mean, we have trouble sometimes transitioning into the new and the better. But that's not just true for us in our physical lives and in our cultural lives, but it's also true for us sometimes spiritually, right? Is that we get moving in a direction. And a lot of times we find that thing that is better. But depending on life's obstacles and the things that come at us, sometimes we're tempted to trend back or drift back in the direction of our old habits and our old salvation, our old life, the old things that worked for us in different times and in different ways. And what the problem is it's not that those things are inherently bad, right? A lot of the back in the day stuff is good stuff. A lot of this is neat and it's fun to look at. But when we have what's new and better, what we begin to realize is that a lot of that stuff's just not sufficient anymore to meet the needs that we find ourselves dealing with. And when we try to substitute something lesser for something better, and then it doesn't meet our needs, we're left frustrated at best and devastated at worst, right? And as we look back, though, this is something that we have to address because this is a trend in itself that humans have dealt with forever. That we always tend to, when life gets a little bit difficult or life gets a little bit hard, we always tend to, romanticize the past and think about how we can go back instead of continuing to move forward. And there's several stories that illustrate that, and even throughout Scripture, that people just like you and I struggled with. One of the biggest ones is in the Old Testament. There was a situation, and you'll be familiar with this. It's when the children of Israel had been slaves for hundreds of years in Egypt. And so God sends Moses in, and Moses goes in, he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. And after several plagues and weeks of this turmoil going on, finally Pharaoh says, get them out of here. And so Moses gathers up 1 million people, and he starts marching across the desert. And so these people are for the first time in generations experiencing God's provision and true freedom. But then they run into a couple of hard days, and things are rough. And do you remember what happens at that point in the story? There's a group of the Israelites. There's a group of them who have the audacity to say, and I get that probably, I guess they just remember it differently, but they come to Moses and they say, why did you even bring us out here? Did you just bring us out here to die? Well, listen, Moses, things were better in Egypt. Things were better back there. I remember we had food to eat and a place to sleep, right? And a place to die, and a place to remain enslaved, and a place to be beaten, and a place to watch your children and your children's children remain in bondage. So they began to fight back, arguing that back in the day was actually better than what God was providing for them in the moment. And sometimes we're tempted in that same direction. In the New Testament, we see this kind of happen again because Jesus comes on the scene, right? There's this time of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but then God shows back up on the scene and he says, I'm sending my son Jesus. And so Jesus comes and he creates this new way, this new path, this new religion called Christianity. Actually, in the time, it was just called the Way. And people began to gather around this movement and this momentum. And Jesus goes through the whole process. At the age of 30, he begins teaching this new way. At the age of 33, he's crucified, and then he's resurrected, and then he leaves, and he leaves behind this group of followers and that he calls his new ecclesia, his new church, his new movement of people and gathering. And so they began to launch out into these church and these church plants and all these new movements of Christ. But a large majority of the first Christians were actually they were Jews. They were from the Jewish community and they had grown up in the Jewish faith. And so during this process of Christianity, when things began to get just a little bit chaotic and the movement was beginning to be pressed back against and there was a lot of struggle surrounding them, there were several of them who came back to the table and they said, hey, you know what? We've been thinking, and we're thinking that maybe we should just go back and pick up some of the old stuff. Like maybe, this stuff with Jesus, it's not as cut and dry as the old stuff was. Because the old stuff, it was just really clear. We had rules, and there were lots of them, and that was hard some days, but at least we knew exactly what to do and when to do it. Everything was black and white. Everything was just super defined. But man, this Jesus stuff, some days it's hard, he just said, just love your neighbor like you love yourself. Well, he didn't really give parameters around that. What does that mean? And then he said, forgive 70 times 7. I don't even know how to do math. So I've lost count when I get to quit forgiving. Right? And they just really struggled with this new way sometimes. And so they would have this tendency to say, well, why don't we pick up some of the old and just do some of that? And these new people, these Gentiles over here, these non-Jews that are becoming Christians, right? Let's just hold them to that same standard. Let's make them do that too. And so during this process, this prompted a lot of the leaders and the teachers to begin this new way of broadcasting this simple but critical message, right? And the idea was just this. It was basically this. Man, we're not going back. Because this new way is better. And while some of that stuff that you look back on, it's not bad in there, it's not all terrible, and we're not just going to throw it out, right? But it's insufficient for our current circumstances. And to this Jewish cultural group, some of the things they were talking about is they were talking about their method of sacrifice, their method of redemption and forgiveness, their method of living and understanding and teaching and growing. They said, look, it's just insufficient anymore. Those things that worked before, they're not as good as the thing we have now. So why would we take something that's lesser and put it in the place of something that's better in the person of Jesus? And so they began teaching this new philosophy. And there were several people who did it, but one person in particular was the guy that we talk about all the time. His name was Paul. And Paul was actually trying to teach this new idea to people, not only from the Jewish community, but the Gentile community, who would all trend back towards other gods and old traditions and old ways. And one time, Paul finally said this in his letter to his friends in Philippi. He said this in Philippians 3. He said, but one thing I do, forgetting what's behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. And Paul says, I forget the stuff that's behind. And I love this because a lot of times we just frame this verse and say, for people who have had a hard life or a difficult past or feel like they're under a burden of shame and guilt and they're unworthy, and they say, man, Paul said, forget the past, man, just move on. God redeemed that and saved that. And that's true. That's not incorrect. It's just incomplete because Paul wasn't just talking about the bad stuff. Paul said, no, we forget all of it. Even the stuff that was good, right? We're moving on. That stuff was good and it served a purpose. For a time, it's how God communicated and walked with his people. But now God's brought you something better in the person of Jesus, and we're moving on to that. I'm pressing forward. I'm not going back. Because while that stuff was good, Jesus is better. He's just better. Right? And so people like Paul would do this, but another writer that pressed this, probably harder than anybody even in the New Testament, was the writer of the book called Hebrews, right? The author of Hebrews. They just pressed this idea that we cannot turn back. And the writer of Hebrews was writing specifically to that Jewish community who was tempted to go back and look at the old ways of God and the old traditions and those old methods. And so the writer of Hebrews, they said, we're going to press forward. And so a lot of people ask a lot of times, well, I hear about Hebrews and people just say the writer of Hebrews or the author of Hebrews. Well, who is that? And so I'll tell you what most scholars agree on right now, the author of Hebrews. We don't know. Okay, I mean, that's what, we don't know. We don't know who the author is. When you ask most scholars, now the one thing that we're certain is that it is a guy, right? Because if it was a woman, it wouldn't be Hebrews, it would be Shebrews. And, just kidding. The reason I say that, though, is actually there is one theory that the author of Hebrews could possibly be the church planter and home church leader, Priscilla. Priscilla and Aquila, they led a church group in their home. And that possibly Priscilla was the writer of this letter. But she could have never pinned her name to it because it would have never been gotten out into public. It would have never been circulated. And so that's one possible theory. But most of them agree that we just don't know who the author is. But we do know that this author was very, very urgent about this idea. That over and over again, the writer of Hebrews, they apparently were looking at their friends and their neighbors, and they were watching people who had begun to kind of drift away. And they had, at least in their lives, experienced Jesus in such a way that they felt it urgent to get this message out. Hey, I just need to let everybody know something. Now's not the time to get distracted. We cannot pull our eyes off of this because, look, I know that old stuff. Some of it is good. And inherently it's not bad, and we can still talk about it and reminisce, and we can be nostalgic, and some of it, even the truth of it, it is useful, but there is a better way to ground and found in a better things to place the entire trust of our lives on. And throughout Hebrews, we find this litany of things where this author continues to return over and over again and say, oh, by the way, you've started to put your stock in this over here. Jesus is better. You've started to put your faith in this over here. Jesus is better. Don't miss this. Don't get distracted from what the most important thing is. And as the author of Hebrews kind of launches out, this is a really cool thing, is the author spends the entire first chapter just reminding people of how great Jesus is. Okay, don't forget this. Don't get distracted. Don't take your eyes off of this Jesus. All right, let me tell you who Jesus is. Let me tell you what he's done. And in that first chapter, there's actually not any commands, but as we start chapter 2, as you start chapter 2 in Hebrews, for the first time, the author says one thing that he'll say over and over again. He says this, he says, pay attention. Pay attention. And when you look at this in the Greek, it's this urgent call. It's like, hey, listen up. Turn your eyes up here. Okay, it's the same thing I do with all of our kids when we're coaching, okay? And, when you got kids and you're trying to coach, it's kind of like rodeoing cats. I don't know if you ever experienced that, especially when it's little kids. And so we do the one thing. We constantly say this. We're like, let me see your eyes. 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 Okay, we have to say it about 10 times because as soon as you get their eyes over here, but then you get their eyes over here, the eyes over here are gone. Let me see your eyes. Let me see your eyes. All right, so let me see your eyes. He says, hey, attention. And I love what he calls attention to. This is what the author in Hebrews 2:1 says. It says this, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, based on what he said in chapter 1, that Jesus is better, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. It's like we have to pay attention. One thing I love is that he used the word pay, right? Because pay, it implies that it's going to cost you something, that it has to be intentional, that it's going to have to be something that you decide to give up yourself, okay? He said, you've got to pay attention. You either pay attention to things or things are going to capture your attention. He said, look, there's stuff all around us to distract us that'll capture our attention, and it's neat and it's fun and some of it's nostalgic. We can't let our attention be captured. We have to pay it in a direction. We need to pay attention so that we do not drift away. But over and over again, he repeats this, and I imagine the author of Hebrews right here. I don't know if any of you fly. Do any of you fly frequently? Am I frequent flyers, okay? Or more than 3 or 4 times in your life you've flown, okay? I love to fly. I love to fly, and we've flown all over the country and all over the world. I love to fly, but I imagine the author of Hebrews in this moment right here and throughout this book kind of taking on the role of a flight attendant. A flight attendant who right before the beginning stands up to give you your instructions. And have you ever been, now the very first time I flew, I was 17 years old when I flew for the very first time. Since then, I try to fly a couple times a week. And no, I don't really. But I was 17 years old, and I remember I was scared to death. I mean, at least very anxious. And I get on this plane, because I wasn't just flying, across the state. On my very first flight, I was flying across the world. I was going to Europe. And so I get on this plane, I'm 17, I sit down, and man, whenever that flight attendant got up and they said, we're about to give you some very important instructions that are all about your safety, okay? And I was like, shh, quiet down, people. I'm trying to pay attention, okay? And I was calling everybody down, but I just know that this flight attendant, they began to go into these instructions, and here's what happens if the cabin loses pressure. The cabin loses pressure? What is he talking about, right? These things will drop from this. What things are going to drop from the ceiling? I mean, I'm just a little bit nervous at this. It's like, and your seat can be used as a flotation device. I'm like, this thing comes loose. But I'm sitting there all anxious, and I'm looking around. Other people, man, they got headphones on, okay, listening to their Walkmans, and it's a long time ago, right? I mean, they got on their headphones. They're flipping. It's this guy right here. Look what this guy's doing. See this guy in the corner? Yeah, that's what everybody else is doing. Flipping through their magazines, right? They're not paying attention. I'm like, hey, I'm going to help this person out. Pay attention up there. Eyes to the front. Everybody, come on. Listen, especially you in the exit row. I'm going to need you, man. I mean, it was so troubling. But I'll be honest. I've flown so much that now, I'm the guy with the headphones in. I'm the guy flipping through the magazine. I'm the guy trying to get the last text in. While this person at the front of this 25-ton piece of metal that we're going to stick 5 miles in the air is giving me instructions that could possibly save my life, right? And I imagine the author of Hebrews being this flight attendant going, hey, you in the back with the magazine, put this down. You do not have time to be distracted right now. We don't have time. No, you need to take the headphones off. You need to listen because there is nothing more important than what I am telling you in this moment right now. I am trying to share with you the truth that will save yours and multiple others' lives. And I need you above all things in this moment right now to listen. Pay attention. Because it's that big of a deal. And for us, right now, sometimes that's the same struggle. And that's the same message. And what's crazy is that for whatever reason, over and over and over again, we need to be reminded. And that's why we try to over and over and again remind you. And for the next 4 weeks, that's what we're going to do, is that we're just going to settle into a place where we remind each other of, above all things, the thing that is better. And we're going to walk through parts of the book of Hebrews, and we're going to look at this. And over again, we're going to hear this author call us to attention and try to shake us out of our drift. And here's what's so interesting about drift. I love that the author of Hebrews uses that word, that idea of drifting. Because spiritually, this is just true, isn't it? All of us have a tendency to drift. We just do. And I love C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors. He has a quote that I'll just kind of paraphrase it. Basically, he says this: I wonder of the people who are far from God now, how many of them intentionally sprinted away? Or how many just drifted? Right? None of us who know Jesus and who he is and what he's done, none of us intentionally sprint away from that, do we? It just happens. We're in this place connected relationally with him in communion one day, and then just days later sometimes we look up and we've just kind of drifted away. right? And that happens to all of us. We have a tendency to drift back toward our natural life. And here's the terrible part of that story, is that until the day we die and leave these bodies, we always will. And that's why the author of Hebrews says this: you can't just go with whatever captures your attention, nostalgic or not. You and I have to pay attention. We have to invest our attention in a very specific direction. Because very few people who know Jesus run from Jesus. Almost everyone who knows Jesus eventually will drift. And we've got to guard against the drift. Why? Because every time we settle for something that's not Jesus, every time we choose a solution to a problem that is not filtered and defined and authored by Jesus, every time we make a decision as a church, and I hope that we never do, but every time we make a decision as a gathering of people outside of Jesus, I promise you, we have settled for lesser instead of better. And there will come a day in our lives, personally, in our relationships, and with the people that we love the most, and for us as a gathering corporately, that will make no sense, that we ever chose the lesser over the better. But we will not drift in the direction of Jesus. It just doesn't happen. We have to pay attention to be sure we go toward Him. I'm excited about this month, and a couple of things that I know that I'll tell you, man. We're going to do a couple of things over the next few weeks. And one is we're going to remind ourselves how much fun some of the things were back in the day. I mean, this is going to be fun, and we'll be nostalgic, and we'll think back, and we'll look. And we'll remember that not all of these things are bad. There's some good things to be had and to be found. But man, that we could become people who are hyper-aware. This one idea. That regardless of what culture offers, regardless of what lays in front or behind, present, past, or future, that only Jesus is better. Jesus is better. And that we would become so hyper-aware of who He is that we would never substitute lesser for better. And how do we do that? Individually and corporately, we begin to learn how to encourage one another to pay attention, to put our attention in a specific direction. And for us as Christians, that's in the direction of the person of Jesus. So over the next few weeks, we're just going to try to remind and reaffirm ourselves that there's nothing in this world, past, present, or future, that's better than Jesus. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father.